Good afternoon, everyone. You're now tuned into a reasonable conversation on Nusound Radio 92 FM. I'm Prerna, and today in the studio we have Satish and Vivek. And we're also very fortunate to be joined by a very special guest, Joe Sidhu QC. Joe is a barrister at 25 Bedford Row, and he's recommending as the leading silk in crime in Chambers and Partners UK 2013. He has expertise in terrorism cases, homicides and fraud, robberies and drug trafficking. He's also the Vice Chair of the Equality and Diversity Committee at the Bar Council and a member of the Criminal Bar Association. He's also the Joint Chair of the Society of Asian Lawyers, and previous to being a barrister, he was a senior researcher for the BBC, and he was also elected councillor with the London Borough of Ealing. Before that, Joe did grow up in Southall, where he went to a state school and then on to Oxford and LSE.
A very good morning to you, thank you.
And good morning to all of our listeners. This is Satish, and Vivek is also here. We've got an extraordinary show, but just to introduce you to the ethos of the show, Joe, It's a reasonable conversation. So long as there's reason behind it, we all have the courage to explore into areas where other people possibly would fear to tread. So with that as an introduction to the show, I'm sure we're going to have an extraordinary time exploring terrorism and legislation and all sorts of issues to do with our Asian community and what we're facing with regard to the justice system as well. Some wonderful questions we have ready for you.
Hey Joe, thank you very much for joining us today again. Thanks
I'm very
for
pleased
being
to be
here.
here. Thank you very much, Prerna.
And we're going to be talking about Asians in the criminal justice system. Being such a great barrister and leading silk in this field, have you come across many Asians in crime?
I think the reality is, of course, that every section of the community at some point in its life will find itself represented in the criminal justice system, either as a victim or as a defendant, or indeed as a member of the legal profession. Because the criminal justice system has a very wide reach. We're talking about people who are the first point of contact with the police when a crime is reported, right up to the judges who are responsible for sentencing if someone's convicted. And so when we talk about Asians within the criminal justice system, we need to remember that they may pop up, but pop up at different points on this particular conveyor belt.
Okay.
What tends to happen generally, I suppose, is that the media get very interested in Asians and black people who are caught up as defendants. And that tends to give a rather skewed picture to the country at large as to what's going on within an individual ethnic minorities community, such as the Asian community. So my experience over the last 20 years of being a barrister has obviously brought me into contact with Asian people at various different levels. I've represented Asian people. I've had to question Asian people as witnesses and victims in crimes. I've had to appear before Asian judges who have been responsible for sentencing, and I've worked alongside colleagues within the legal profession, both barristers and solicitors, who are of Asian origin. And so what I would say is Asians have increasingly made their presence felt throughout the criminal justice system in every department. And I think that's a healthy development in some respects. Obviously, no one wants to see Asian people as defendants in courts, but the reality is that we must accept, having been in this country for 40 or 50 years, that the way in which every new migrant community evolves means that they extend their reach into all parts of society. They will move into the professions, they'll move into businesses, they'll move into manual work, they'll move into all sorts of areas. And inevitably, sometimes things go wrong. And Asian people will find themselves on the wrong side of the dock in a court. And it's a regrettable development, but I don't think it's anything that should catch us by surprise. I don't think we should be fearful of it. I think what we need to do is to recognize that as a developing ethnic community, we will find that people, generally younger people within our community, will sometimes make wrong choices. And it's our responsibility as a community to recognize that we're not perfect, not to be defensive about the things that go wrong, not always to look for other people to blame, but to spend time conversing with ourselves and conversing with the wider community, which is really important, to get to the bottom of where these problems start. And if we can root them out, then hopefully we won't see the ongoing development of Asian defendants, but we will see the ongoing development of Asian lawyers, Asian judges, and Asians within the police force, and all of those who are responsible for keeping our community safe.
Joe, I have to say, just listening to you there, it makes it sound so positive and so wonderful, and we're all feeling as though the future looks bright.
Well, but I was going to say maybe for you. I noticed that Joe said something about young people.
I know.
I was going to say, is it a larger proportion of young people within the Asian community who usually find themselves, as defendants?
I think that's an interesting question, actually, Vivek, because I think there's not really much difference, I would imagine, between the demographics of people who are caught up as defendants or suspects or arrested by the police, between the Asian community and the white community, for example. I think that the reality of it is this, that if you're younger and you're Asian and you're growing up in this society, you won't have been imbued with quite the same strength of values that older people within our Asian community have. Because older people have come from often abroad, where they're raised in a different environment. Even when their lives have been largely concentrated in the UK, they may have come over at a young age, for example, from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, or East Africa, and their sensibilities, their value systems are still very much traditional. But younger people who are schooled here, born and brought up here, obviously are living between and within more than one culture. So the influences that operate on young people are different. And, of course, that means that in some ways the restraints on behavior that operate with older Asian people don't apply with such strength on younger Asian people. And I think this is an important conversation that we need to have, because it's not a question of us aspiring to carry on some traditional concept of what being a good Asian is. We have to be realistic. We live in this country. We contribute to this country. We make our own way. And younger Asian people have more than one identity that they subscribe to. All right? So sometimes they may feel they're pulled in a different direction. I know, for example, in my own casework, where I'm dealing with homicides, often the homicides are gang-related. If you take, for example, where we're sitting now, in London, you will have very many gangs operating. They are gangs sometimes which are white, but often they are also ethnic minority, because London is such a cosmopolitan city. It's no surprise if you're going to see gangs, you're going to see gangs from Asian, Chinese, black backgrounds. And I have noticed an increase of interest amongst younger Asian people in getting involved in gangs. Now, this, of course, doesn't reflect in any sense the younger generation as a whole. But there is almost a lost generation, particularly in the recession of the last 5 or 6 years, where young people aren't able to get work so easily. There's almost this lost generation who are looking for some sort of sense of identity, and where it's offered by a gang, for example, which provides security and status and reputation, then some younger Asian people will be attracted to that, and before you know it, they get involved in all sorts of things which could get them in trouble with the police. The worst of which, of course, is gang violence leading to someone being murdered. And it's extremely sad for me to see when that happens, a gang, an Asian gang, attacking, for example, another Asian gang. And I had a case of this type last year at the Old Bailey. And when you see this happening, it is heartbreaking, because you can only imagine that the parents of these young men, and they are invariably men, they're young men, sometimes teenage boys, those parents must be incredibly disappointed and ashamed of what is going on with the youngsters concerned. The youngsters themselves sometimes don't recognize how much shame they're bringing upon their families. And let's face it, within the Asian community, shame has operated as a discipline on people's behavior. Things that people might be tempted to do, they stop short of doing if they think it would reflect badly on themselves or their families. And that concept of shame doesn't apply with the same strength anymore for those who are perhaps under the age of 30.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Only a couple of weeks ago we were talking about some of the difficulties in youngsters putting down roots. You mentioned that the older generation came with very stable roots in their identity. And we were talking about mental health and the conflict of identities over youngsters in this country. And that's something we're very much aware of. Before we talk about other people passing through the system, Joe, I did want to press you on one little thing. It springs to mind that our most famous litigator, I suppose, was Mahatma Gandhi, and he was a product of this country's legal system, and he encountered a great deal of resistance, shall we say, in passing through the establishment. As you passed through the establishment to become a QC, did you personally encounter resistance of that sort in your path, your journey?
It's a very interesting question, Satish, because everyone's individual experience, by definition, is unique to them. If someone doesn't have an experience of direct discrimination against them, doesn't mean it doesn't take place elsewhere to other people. For my own part, I've actually very rarely encountered anything that I could describe as obvious prejudice or discrimination. That may, in some senses, reflect the profession I'm a member of. The bar, of course, is a very traditional profession. It's one in which, integrity and honour and responsibility and truth are very much part of our DNA. You don't generally find barristers behaving badly. They don't generally speak in prejudicial or insulting ways to other barristers. So I'm not surprised that my own experience has been one that I have avoided that. Also, of course, it's how you project yourself. And if you project yourself in a confident way and you are competent in your job, it makes it all the more difficult for anyone to pick at you or to find reason to be hurtful in their comments. So my own experience has been happily a generally good one. However, I know that within the legal profession there is an ongoing struggle to ensure that discriminatory practices are eliminated. And we know, for example, at the moment that there is a huge battle with the government over legal aid. Legal aid is an essential provision for people generally, but particularly so for the ethnic minorities, who, when they are in difficulty, often need to have public funding to support them, and they need good, competent lawyers to represent them, and particularly lawyers who understand them in a way which is empathetic. And so we have had a fantastic increase over the last number of years of Asians within the solicitor's profession, and a very noticeable increase I have seen over the last 20 years of younger Asians coming into the barrister's profession. And I want to ensure that that trend continues, because these solicitors and barristers are our judges of the future. So they will hold the power to decide whether people go to prison or not. And they need to be able to do so objectively without prejudice. But if we throttle for example, legal aid, I'm afraid to say what we're going to find is that the diversity we have painstakingly built up within the legal professions is going to be dismantled. So whilst I'm optimistic at the moment, I have one eye on the future, and I think it's very important that Asian people, not just who are lawyers, but those within the community and community groups and radio stations like this, come together to make sure that we all can have proper representation, and that means we need to make our views known to the government. If we feel this is an intrusion on our rights, it's something which we need to protect.
Wonderful. You've just touched on the difficulties that the legal aid system is going through recently, and I recall only a couple of weeks ago, the first time in their history, lawyers were out on strike. But we'll dig a little bit deeper on that in a few moments. But here are some messages from our advertisers, and we'll be with you on the other side.
Hi, this is Prerna. Join Satish, Vivek and I for Reasonable Conversation. Have your say every Sunday 12 to 1, exploring controversial topics on nusound Radio.
Welcome back to A Reasonable Conversation with me, Vivek, Prerna, Satish, and today we've got Joe Sidhu QC on our radio show talking about the justice system and Asians, in relation to it. Do get in touch. We've already had a few texts in. It'd be great to have a caller, ask us, any of the questions you want. Ask Joe some difficult questions. Text us in on 07961 387 787 and join the conversation by calling the studio number on 0208 472 9292.
We've had a text in from Chanda who said, I find children born here to parents who are from the Indian subcontinent. They don't have the same values as their parents, and some of the kids are ashamed of them. So do you think this is where we're going wrong, with children being ashamed of their parents and then getting into gangs, doing all this bravado to come far away from their culture as possible?
I think it's a really important question because it goes wider than the law. We're talking here about culture and the law, and whether young people who get so alienated as they feel from their parents' generation find themselves turning in a different direction, which isn't necessarily a good one. Young people are going to find their own way. Every generation has to find its own way, and every generation will discover a new synthesis of their old culture and the new culture, and they will create something new for themselves. I mean, I have been incredibly impressed with the dynamism and creativity that I have seen developing amongst the younger Asian generation. There's a huge amount going on, and in many diverse ways.